Thank you for watching, liking, commenting, and subscribing. The antique radio, a hulking, walnut monstrosity that had lain dormant in the attic for decades, its surface thick with dust and forgotten stories, began to scream. Not a sound anyone would recognize as music, not even static of the familiar kind. This was something else entirely. A high-pitched keening that scraped against the inside of your skull like nails on a chalkboard, a sound that promised pain and oblivion with every distorted note. It started faintly, a spectral whisper barely audible beneath the rustling of the old house. A phantom breeze slipping through cracks in the foundation, a sound that could easily be dismissed as the wind playing tricks against the eaves. But then it grew, swelling like a malignant tumor, until it filled the entire attic space, the air vibrating with its intensity, and then began to seep out, a sickening tide spreading through the floorboards, down the stairs, and into the rest of the house. I, Elias Thorne, a man steeped in the dreary monotony of my existence as a probate lawyer, a life as brittle as the documents I handled, was the only one home at the time. My wife, Clara, was out visiting her sister, a weekly ritual I had come to both dread and rely on for the few hours of solitude it provided, a respite as welcome as it was fleeting. I had been meticulously cataloging some of my deceased uncle's belongings, a task I undertook with a grim resignation. It felt like sifting through the forgotten scraps of a life that never truly mattered, much like my own existence at times, each item a tombstone in a graveyard of lost potential. The house, itself a relic of my family's forgotten grandeur, always felt oppressive, a mausoleum of silence and unspoken regrets, its very bones whispering of forgotten sins. The radio's sudden outburst, therefore, was not just jarring. It felt like a violation, a grotesque intrusion into the carefully constructed stillness, like a scream tearing through the fabric of a long-held secret. I remember dropping the dusty ledger I was holding, its brittle pages fluttering to the floor like dying moths, each one a lost testament to a forgotten life. The sound was relentless, drilling into my ears, a torturous symphony of dissonance, and I clapped my hands over them, but it was no use. The scream was inside me now, resonating within my bones, a parasitic echo of some unknown dread, a physical manifestation of something ancient and malignant. I had ascended to the attic, drawn by the awful noise, each step on the creaking staircase feeling like a descent into some subterranean abyss, each groan of the wood a whispered warning. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, the scent of forgotten things that had slowly turned to dust, the aroma of time itself consuming the past. The radio, perched precariously on a stack of yellowed newspapers, thrummed with an unnatural energy, its very core pulsating with an unholy life. Its bakelite casing was warm to the touch, almost feverish, like the skin of a fevered child, and the dial was spinning wildly, as if an invisible hand were desperately searching for a signal that didn't exist. It wasn't just the noise that was unsettling. It was the feeling it invoked, a sense of profound wrongness, a violation of all that was natural, of being observed by something ancient and malevolent, a presence that had always been lurking just beyond the veil. The scream felt purposeful, like a warning, or worse, an invitation, a siren song calling to the darkest parts of myself. It was a sound that tore at the fabric of reality, leaving me feeling adrift, disconnected from the normal world, a lonely ship lost on a sea of madness. I moved closer, my hand instinctively reaching out to silence it, despite the primal fear that was screaming inside me, a silent scream as potent as the radio's cacophony. I knew, somewhere in the logical recesses of my mind, that this wasn't just faulty wiring. It was something more, something that defied explanation, something ancient that had awakened after its long slumber. As I reached for the knob, the screaming suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, heavier than any sound I had ever heard, a void that pressed in on me from all sides. I stood there, bathed in the unnatural quiet, my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive silence, the taste of bile rising in my throat. The attic was still, silent except for the gentle tick-tock of a grandfather clock downstairs, a relentless rhythm that seemed to count down my impending doom, a sound that suddenly felt ominous, each tick a countdown to some unknown horror. I pulled my hand back, a strange numbness tingling through my fingers, like frostbite creeping up my limbs. The radio was silent, its dial resting haphazardly between two unmarked frequencies, a map to a place that should not be. The air hung heavy, thick with an unspoken threat, a tangible dread that permeated every fiber of my being. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the machine, my senses screaming at me to flee, a chorus of terror that resonated deep within my core. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was just the beginning, that something had awakened, and it was not going to be easily silenced, a monster unleashed from the depths of the past. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like the moment before a predator strikes, a terrifying calm before the storm. The ordinary world had shifted on its axis, replaced by something dark and unknown, a nightmare bleeding into my reality. The house itself felt different, colder, a tomb that was growing ever more frigid, and the shadows seemed to deepen, becoming less like the absence of light and more like entities in their own right, sinister shapes lurking in the corners of the unseen. As I descended the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, followed by something that existed just beyond the veil of perception, a silent stalker always just behind my shoulder. The experience wasn't just unsettling. It was profoundly disturbing, as though a fundamental law of the universe had been violated, a tear in the fabric of everything I had once believed. This wasn't about faulty equipment. It was about something else entirely, something that had been dormant for too long. And now it had been unleashed, and it had chosen my house to be the stage for whatever horrors it had in mind, a grotesque theater where I was the unwilling star. The silence of the house was no longer comforting. It was a suffocating shroud, a prison that was slowly closing in on me. And I knew the radio's scream, that bone-chilling cacophony, was the harbinger of a nightmare that was just beginning to unfold. And in the depths of my heart, I knew it was all about a man, a phantom, the spooky man that my mother would always try to protect me from, a boogeyman made real. The evening that followed the radio's unnerving outburst was steeped in an unnerving sense of unease. The house, usually a place of predictable quiet, now hummed with a subtle, almost imperceptible energy, like a living thing holding its breath, its very structure now a vessel for something malevolent. I found myself constantly listening, straining my ears for any recurrence of that ghastly scream. But the silence persisted, more terrifying in its oppressive stillness, a suffocating blanket that threatened to smother me. Clara returned around 7, her usual cheerful disposition failing to dispel the gloom that had settled over the house, her bright smile a fragile beacon against the encroaching darkness. I tried to explain what had happened in the attic, but the words sounded inadequate, foolish even, against the backdrop of her normal, mundane concerns, like trying to describe a nightmare to someone in the bright light of day. She dismissed it with a gentle laugh, blaming my overactive imagination and the house's old age, her naivety a thin shield against the horrors that were about to unfold. She suggested I'd been spending too much time alone with dusty old things, a statement that felt like both a jab and a pathetic truth, a hollow accusation that stung with an unexpected sharpness. I didn't press the matter, knowing that she wouldn't understand, that the abyss that had opened before me was one I had to face alone. The dread I felt was something visceral, something that existed outside the realm of logic and reason, and it was a feeling that was becoming more intense by the passing minute, a living thing that was slowly consuming me. The silence was, as it seemed to be, a living thing, a predator stalking in the shadows, a hunter savoring its prey before the kill. We ate a strained dinner, the clinking of silverware on plates echoing loudly in the otherwise quiet dining room. Each tiny sound amplified in the oppressive silence, a distorted percussion piece. The conversation was stilted, punctuated by long silences, each one filled with the unspoken tension that had taken root in the house, a chasm of unspoken dread widening between us. After dinner, Clara retreated to the living room to watch her mindless television programs, her only solace in a world that had become too dark and unpredictable, while I sought refuge in my study, a sanctuary that had become a prison cell. The room, lined with bookshelves filled with law books and old family journals, had always been my sanctuary, but now it felt more like a cage, a fortress besieged from within. The old books seemed to watch me with their dusty, leather-bound eyes, each spine a skeletal gaze, their secrets locked away within their brittle pages, their presence no longer comforting but instead like sentinels, guarding something insidious, a silent army of forgotten knowledge protecting a terrible truth. I tried to lose myself in work, attempting to focus on the tedious details of some estate case. But the words blurred on the page, the legal jargon meaningless against the backdrop of the mounting dread, a futile attempt to impose order on chaos. The walls seemed to close in, the silence pressing against my eardrums like a physical force, a suffocating pressure that threatened to crush me. As the night wore on, the silence itself began to change. It was no longer just the absence of sound, but something else, something that thrummed with an almost palpable presence, an unseen current that vibrated through the house's very core. The house seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, the walls whispering secrets just below the threshold of hearing, a chorus of the damned murmuring from the very bones of the building. At first, the whispers were indistinct, a jumble of indiscernible syllables, like the hushed murmuring of a crowd heard from a great distance, a cacophony of tormented voices. But slowly they began to coalesce into something more defined, words and phrases that seemed to float out of the woodwork, disembodied voices that spoke in the language of nightmares, a chilling lexicon of dread and despair. I tried to rationalize it, blaming it on fatigue, on the stress of the day, but I knew it was something more, something that defied explanation, something that had seeped into my very soul. The whispers weren't coming from outside the house. They were coming from within it, from the very foundations, the walls themselves, a chorus of voices rising from the heart of the house. They spoke my name, my full name, Elias Thorne, repeated over and over, like a litany of doom, each repetition laced with a malevolent intent, a chilling invocation that tore at my sanity. And they whispered of him, not his name exactly, but all the horrible ways he would appear, that he was coming, that I was the reason why, horrifying visions of a specter that was always just beyond the edge of my perception, a creature birthed from the depths of my own fear. The names, the descriptions, it made no sense, but it filled me with the most profound sense of fear I had ever encountered, a terror that seemed to burrow deep into my bones and latch onto my soul. As I listened, paralyzed by a primal fear, I began to distinguish other words within the murmuring cacophony, fragmented sentences that seemed to piece together into a coherent narrative, a story that was both horrifying and deeply personal, a twisted tapestry woven from the threads of my own forgotten past. They whispered of the house's history, of the generations that had lived and died within its walls, of the secrets and the sins that had been buried within its foundations, a horrifying lineage of despair and sorrow. They spoke of a man, a figure shrouded in darkness, a presence that had lingered in the house for centuries, waiting for his moment to awaken, a malevolent entity bound to this place by blood and sin. This figure was always just out of reach of my perception, a shadowy entity that seemed to flicker at the edges of my vision, always there in the corner of my eye, but never fully visible, taunting me, testing me, a phantasm that haunted the peripheries of my reality. It was the figure from my childhood nightmares, the one my mother had warned me about, the spooky man that was never quite there, but always seemed just within my reach, the boogeyman reborn in the shadows of this accursed place. The whispers seemed to revel in my fear, feeding on it, growing stronger with each passing moment, a parasitic force drawing power from my despair. The house felt like a living organism, a monstrous entity that was slowly consuming me. And I was alone, trapped within its suffocating embrace, a fly caught in a spider's web, each frantic struggle only tightening my bonds. I understood, with a terrible certainty, that I was no longer in control, that something ancient and evil had awakened, and it was coming for me, and I would be powerless to stop it, a helpless victim caught in the relentless tide of fate. The night was long and sleepless, filled with the torment of the whispering walls, a torturous vigil in the face of an encroaching madness. The world had shifted into something sinister, and the house, once a symbol of my family's past, had become a prison, and I was the prisoner, awaiting execution, my fate sealed within the cursed confines of these walls. The following day dawned bleak and overcast, the sky mirroring the dark mood that had taken root within the house, a sky the color of despair itself. Sleep had been an impossible luxury, and I woke up feeling drained and disoriented, as if I had been fighting a battle against invisible enemies, my body a battlefield ravaged by unseen wounds. The whispers from the night before were still ringing in my ears, echoing like a haunting melody, a chorus of torment that refused to be silenced, a constant reminder of the horror that awaited me. I moved through the morning routine with a mechanical precision, my thoughts consumed by the events of the past 24 hours, my mind a prison haunted by phantom sounds and fleeting shadows. Clara, oblivious to the growing horror, went about her day with her usual placid cheerfulness, oblivious to the insidious changes that had overtaken our home, her innocence a stark contrast to the darkness that was engulfing me. I tried to talk to her again, to explain the whispers, the sense of dread, but the words seemed to catch in my throat, and I was left with a feeling of profound isolation, a lonely voice shouting into an uncaring void. How could I possibly explain the unexplainable, the creeping horror that had taken root in the very walls of the house, a terrifying experience that defied all logic and reason? I felt like I was living in a different reality, separated from her and the rest of the world, trapped within the confines of a nightmare, a lone survivor adrift in a sea of terror. The feeling of being watched had intensified, a constant awareness of a presence just beyond the edges of my perception, an unseen observer that knew my every move. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that seemed to writhe and shift, but whenever I turned to face them, they would vanish, leaving behind only an unnerving stillness, a phantasm that reveled in my growing fear. The house seemed to be toying with me, playing a cruel game, drawing me deeper and deeper into its web of terror, a malevolent entity savoring its impending victory. As the day progressed, the usual mundane noises of the house began to take on a sinister quality, the familiar sounds twisting into a grotesque symphony of dread. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like the slow, deliberate beat of a funeral drum. The creaking of the floorboards like footsteps following close behind me, the rustling of the curtains like whispered threats, each sound a chilling reminder of the presence that haunted my waking hours. I found myself jumping at every sudden sound, my senses constantly on high alert, waiting for the next manifestation of this unknown terror, a state of perpetual terror that threatened to break my mind. In the afternoon, a storm began to gather, the sky growing darker and darker, as if the heavens themselves were mirroring the malevolence that had taken root within the house, a cosmic reflection of the darkness that had enveloped my soul. The wind howled through the eaves, rattling the windows, its mournful cries sounding like the tormented wails of lost souls, lost to the spooky man, a chorus of despair echoing from the very heart of the storm. The power flickered, the lights blinking on and off, plunging the house into intermittent darkness, and in those moments of fleeting shadows, I would see them. He was always there, a shadowy figure lurking just out of sight, a glimpse of him in the darkened doorway, a flicker of movement at the edge of the staircase, a barely visible form dissolving in the darkness behind a curtain, a specter that danced in the periphery of my vision. It was always the same, a tall, gaunt shape with long, spindly limbs and a face obscured by shadows, the embodiment of all my childhood fears, a creature born from my deepest nightmares. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the stress and the lack of sleep were playing tricks on me, but the figure felt all too real, all too terrifying. It had been waiting, and it had come for me, a phantasm that had finally emerged from the shadows. With every flicker of the light, the shadows in the house seemed to deepen, the rooms growing darker and more oppressive. And he came closer, the feeling of his presence more real, more dangerous, an encroaching darkness that promised oblivion. The flickering lights were not random. They were purposeful, a deliberate attempt to unsettle me, to break my resolve, a carefully orchestrated torture that preyed on my fears. The storm outside intensified, the rain lashing against the windows like the furious blows of a fist, and the house seemed to groan and shift under the force of the wind, as if it was about to collapse in on itself, taking me with it, a structure on the verge of imploding under the weight of its own malevolence. The power went out completely, plunging the entire house into darkness, and the only light came from the flickering flames of the candles I had hurriedly lit, a fragile defense against the encroaching darkness. The shadows danced wildly across the walls, twisting and distorting familiar objects into grotesque shapes, and the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next manifestation of the horror, a silent pause before the final descent into madness. I sat there in the darkness, surrounded by the flickering candlelight, my heart pounding against my ribs, listening to the storm raging outside, feeling utterly alone and helpless, a prisoner trapped in his own personal hell. The whispers were back, louder now, more insistent, weaving a tapestry of terror, painting gruesome images of the thing that was lurking in the shadows, that was coming for me, with his long, spindly limbs and a face that would forever remain shrouded in the darkest of shadows, a horrifying litany of the doom that awaited me. The spooky man had come home, and this time, he was ready to stay, a monster unleashed after centuries of slumber. And with each flickering of light, I knew he was getting closer and closer to claiming me, the darkness reaching out its skeletal fingers to drag me into the abyss. The final confrontation was not a dramatic clash of forces, a battle between good and evil. It was far more insidious, a slow, agonizing surrender to the inevitable, a slow fade into oblivion. The house, by this point, was no longer just a structure. It had become a living entity, a part of the darkness, a vessel for the malevolent presence that had taken root within its walls, a parasite that had fully integrated with its host. The days bled into nights, each one indistinguishable from the last, filled with the incessant whispers, the flickering shadows, the constant awareness of being watched, a monotonous rhythm of terror that eroded my very being. I had ceased trying to fight it, to rationalize it, to escape it. There was no escape. My attempts to leave the house, those few times I dared to venture out, always ended the same way, a strange, disorienting compulsion that drew me back in, like a moth to a flame, an irresistible force that bound me to this place of suffering. The outside world had become a distant memory, a fleeting image of normality that I knew I could never return to, a phantom limb aching for a world that was now lost forever. Clara, lost to the same encroaching darkness, had become a shell of her former self, her eyes vacant, her movements mechanical, a ghost in her own life. She had stopped talking, her presence in the house a silent, spectral reminder of what I had lost, of who we once were, a constant torment in the heart of my despair. We existed together in the same space, yet we were separated by an unbridgeable gulf, trapped within our own separate nightmares, two souls adrift in a shared ocean of terror. The spooky man, now no longer a fleeting figure in the shadows, had become a constant presence, a phantom always at the edge of my peripheral vision. He would appear in the corners of my vision, standing just out of reach, his tall, gaunt form a menacing silhouette against the flickering candlelight, a skeletal figure taunting me from the shadows. Sometimes he would move closer, his long, spindly fingers brushing against my skin, the touch sending shivers of icy dread down my spine, a chilling caress that promised nothing but oblivion. His face remained hidden, shrouded in shadows, but I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that it was a face that I did not want to see, that it would be the final, devastating glimpse before my own demise, a glimpse that would tear apart what little remained of my sanity. The whispers had intensified, growing louder, more demanding. They no longer spoke of the past, but of the future, of the eternity I would spend within the house, bound to its darkness, a permanent fixture within its walls, a sentence to eternal suffering within the haunted confines of this accursed place. They whispered of the loneliness that awaited me, the endless torment, the eternal silence, a glimpse into the abyss that was about to swallow me whole. And they whispered his name, not the name my mother had used to scare me, no. It was a name that clawed at my mind, a name that resonated with the deep, black roots of my soul, a name that was both terrifyingly familiar and horrifically foreign. They told me, the whispers, that his name was mine, that I was him, and he was me, a horrifying truth that shattered the illusion of my identity. The final night was the worst of them all. The storm outside raged with a fury I had never witnessed, the wind howling like a banshee, the rain lashing against the windows like the relentless blows of a hammer, a chaotic symphony of destruction that mirrored the storm raging within my own mind. The power was gone, completely and irrevocably, and the only light came from the dying flames of the candles, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like grotesque phantoms, a macabre ballet of light and shadow. The house groaned and creaked, its old timbers straining under the force of the storm, and the walls seemed to pulse, to breathe, as if the house itself was about to give birth to some unspeakable horror, a living nightmare on the verge of breaking into the real world. The spooky man appeared before me, no longer a shadowy figure, but a solid presence, his tall, gaunt form filling the doorway, blocking out the flickering light, a skeletal specter blocking my only escape. He reached out his long, spindly fingers, and as they touched my face, the darkness closed in, not in a rush, but with a slow, deliberate embrace, a final surrender to the abyss. There was no pain, no struggle, just a final, agonizing sense of surrender, a silent acceptance of a fate that had been decided long ago. In the instant before the darkness fully consumed me, I saw his face. Not the shadowy, formless face I had expected, but my own, twisted and distorted, a grotesque reflection of the man I had become, a horrifying mirror that revealed the true monster I had become. And in his eyes, there was not malice, not hatred, only a deep, profound sense of loneliness, a mirrored reflection of my own despair, a horrifying realization that I was both the victim and the tormentor. The house is now silent. The storm has passed, and the sun has risen, casting a pale, indifferent light over the scene, a mocking dawn that illuminated the emptiness of my demise. The old radio sits in the attic, its dial frozen in place, forever silent, a testament to the horrors that it had unleashed. The whispers have faded, replaced by an eerie, all-encompassing silence, a silence that is more terrifying than any sound, a void that speaks volumes of the terror that has been endured. Clara, a hollow shell, still roams the halls, her eyes vacant, her movements mechanical, a ghost trapped in a house of ghosts. And I'm no longer here, not in the way that I once was. I am a part of the house now, bound to its darkness, a permanent fixture within its walls, my soul imprisoned within the very bones of this haunted place. My essence, fractured and distorted, echoes in the shadows, in the creaking of the floorboards, in the whispers that are now silent to all but those who dare to listen too closely, a chilling reminder that some horrors cannot be escaped. The house is waiting, always waiting, and the echoes of that awful silence are the only things left, a testament to the lingering terror. There is no peace, no resolution, only the bleak, eternal echo of what was, and the terrifying certainty of what will always be, a haunting that will forever remain. The spooky man did not come for me. I was him all along, and now the house waits, patiently, for its next victim. For we are all haunted, and some of us, like me, just become the haunting, a terrible truth that resonates into the very fabric of this existence.